Well, hello everybody. You all, I'm sure, know me, Jyotidana, and hello everybody on screen. Hi everyone. I think most of you all know me as well, and yes, good to be here in Shrewsbury. So I always say when I come here, big night out for me. Get out of the village, then go back over there. That's that. So we're going to have a talk on the Buddha's going forth, which I'm sure we all know in different ways. And I know it very well, but then tonight I thought, oh, actually, no, I need to brush up on it. But we kind of do know it, you know. And it's really good getting back in touch with the Buddha, because sometimes he sort of feels a bit over there, you know, he feels a little bit distant. And the more we sort of look at his texts, his teachings, and his story, he sort of comes right back. So I feel very enthused tonight. And I've been in dialogue recently with somebody regarding the tree of refuge and respect. As some of you may know, a tree with teachers of past and present, and our teacher Sangharakshita on it. And it's really come back alive. So there's something about being in dialogue as well with the Dharma, with our friends, that bring it back to life, rather than sort of keeping it here, you know, keeping it in our heads, which sometimes can happen. So I'm going to start with a poem from Mary Oliver, which I often start with, a bit indulgent. I often do it. It's almost like I've only had one poem ever made an impact, but it's kind of relevant, and it's The Journey by Mary Oliver. And I was thinking how the Buddha going forth made me think how we all at some point go forth in our lives. And it's not always easy. You know, sometimes it can feel really clean and easy. It's like, I've had enough, I'm going. And other times it can be really quite fraught and quite scary. So I love this poem. I always think it sort of describes how one can feel when you want to go and you don't feel you can go. And in the end, you just think, right, I am going. It's quite liberating. One day you find in you what you had to do, and began, though the voices around you kept shouting their bad advice, though the whole house began to tremble, and you felt the old tug at your ankles. Mend my life, each voice cried, but you didn't stop. You knew what you had to do, though the wind pried with its stiff fingers at the very foundations, though their melancholy was terrible. It was already late enough and a wild night, and the road full of fallen branches and stones. But little by little, as you left their voices behind, the stars began to burn through the sheets of clouds, and there was a new voice which you slowly recognized as your own, that kept you company as you strode deeper and deeper into the world, determined to do the only thing you could do, determined to save the only life you could save. I do love that. It does conjure up some kind of visual, sort of dark, cold, windy night. Everything's, you know, blustery, scary, and you just think, I'm going to go for it. So I think there's something about that for me, and I think the Buddha must have felt like that as well. There must have been something that took him forward, but also something that held him back. And it's a horrible place to be, you know, when you're sort of stuck. It's quite draining when you're in that kind of flow of things. Yeah. So I was thinking about the Buddha's going forth tonight, and what I realised is there are many different versions depending on what traditions you're in or cultures that you come from. There's lots of historical accuracies. There's also lots of myth, and it's traditional, but also, you know, there can be modern sort of bits put in as well, depending on who's telling it. But the good news is it's got the same thread running through it. So I was with another tradition previous to Jyotidana and definitely had the same thread running through it. Hooray. So there must be some historical truth in that for me. And it all kind of ties together. And firstly, I thought we'll set the scene, because it's very difficult to imagine the time of the Buddha. I don't have a great imagination. And it's really hard to imagine 2,500 years ago in the Buddha's time, what it really would have been like for him living where they lived. No street lamps, no cars, no social media, no online Dharma courses, no books, no beginners groups. You know, it was just this sort of desolate landscape, I should imagine, miles from each village, no cars to get into to visit each other. People were probably very protective and probably very much into their farming, making sure that the crops were sort of ripe for the next year, and being very weather dependent and guided by the sun and the moon and the rain and the stars. And I just find that quite hard to imagine, going places on foot like the Buddha did, going forth into the unknown. And kind of, we do have a rough idea now, don't we? Because we've got sat-navs and we've got maps and we can ask people. But in those days, you know, you really were on your own. You were going through jungles and desolate areas, barefooted, not knowing where you were going and who you were going to meet. And so it's really sort of important to try and get back into that time when you think about the Buddha. Just think about that landscape that he would have been in. And so I find it so hard. But I suppose if you'd asked the Buddha all that time ago to imagine this, he probably wouldn't have done that either. So we've got satellite TV, we've got this, we've got central heating. He probably would have sort of been mind-blowing. But yeah, it's good to set the scene when we imagine Siddhartha in those days. So he lived in the 6th century BC. Siddhartha Gautama was his name. Born to a wealthy family on the border of India and Nepal, called Kapilavastu. Some say he was a prince, and then in other books I've read that he was just a very wealthy sort of person as part of a clan. His father was sort of leader of a clan. So either way, he was born into wealth. He was very privileged in a way. And the Shakya clan was very well respected and high up. And it was said that Siddhartha had a very comfortable life with few needs. And everything was sort of to hand, really. He was kind of cotton-wooled a bit, you know, he was sort of kept in this lovely village, miles away from any sort of war and famine and despair and despondency. And, you know, within reason, he had a very comfortable life. He excelled at archery and martial arts and crafts. And he somewhat was kept away from the outside matters. And he was discouraged from leaving the clanship. And probably because it wouldn't have been safe to go out, particularly if you were privileged, you know, to take your sort of self out into the other villages with other clans and bandits could have been quite threatening. So he was sort of discouraged from that. And in a way, I was thinking, well, why would he need to go anywhere else? He was a young man and he was given everything. Everything he wanted was in that sort of area that he wanted. So I thought, well, actually, it's a bit like that for us, isn't it? You know, when we're in the house and it's warm and it's cozy and it's raining outside, why would we go outside? You know, it's like, bother. As was tradition, it was said that he was married early, and apparently 16 years approximately was the age for getting married then. And soon after, he had a healthy son with his wife. And everything, it seemed, was paved out for him and somewhat expected. There were expectations that he was, you know, living a certain way and going along with what was approved of within that clan, I think. And I wonder how much choice in this comfortable, positive life that he actually had. Because I was thinking, you know, sometimes I've been in comfortable situations, but I've had to do a particular thing to be in that comfortable situation, like work or whatever it is. And I thought, I wonder if at some points the Buddha, or Siddhartha at the time, was just towing the line a bit, you know, if he was pleasing his family, doing what was expected, going along with what the culture did, going along with what you were supposed to do. Or maybe he was having a whale of a time. We'll never know. But, you know, that's how it was, I think. But it seemed underneath it all that he was deeply dissatisfied. And he knew there was more to life than what had been given him. And I've experienced that myself. I'm not sure if any of you have, where, you know, everything's quite smooth. It's all right. We've got heating, we've got some money in our pocket, we've got a nice partner, we've got a car that's quite nice, you know, a better garden than the neighbours. got full-time work, so everything should be fine, you know. And especially if you're a Buddhist, everything should be really, really fine. But, you know, sometimes it's just, are we just getting a bit comfortable or a bit despondent or a bit stale? Or are we sort of thinking, yeah, but there must be something more? Am I just settling in and just, you know, doing what I usually do? Am I just going through the motions? And I think that's what brought me here, you know, brought me in the beginning to the Dharma. Although I was having a reasonably good time partying, going out, having fun, I actually was quite dissatisfied with it and started to think, gosh, is this my life? And it was quite a strange feeling when you sort of say that, you know, is this my life? And yeah, I felt a little bit miserable at that point. So yeah, I'm sure the Siddhartha felt that. So I'm wondering if he was thinking about the wider context and things that were out there that were being hidden from him. It was sort of things that he wasn't to see. And that must have been quite frustrating, you know, being kept in this sort of safe, lovely, conditioned existence. So it was said that Siddhartha began to venture outside the limits of the Shakyan boundaries. And on his travels, he came across what is known as the four sights. So I'm sure you're familiar with those, quite traditional four sights. So within the villages that he visited under cover of the night, in disguise, firstly, he saw an old person who was frail and bent over. And I'm sure there would have been people in his township that were like that, but I think it was kind of hidden away from him. And it was all sort of healthy warrior types that were sort of in view. Old people probably shuffled off to a smaller village around the corner, like they kind of are now, really. But yeah, that was a real sight for him, that he actually saw people getting old and frail. And secondly, he saw a sight that where he experienced disease, so sickness. And I would imagine there would have been lots and lots and lots of different diseases in those times, incurable. There wasn't the medicines and the science in those days, and there may well have been people lying at the side of the road, ill, needing help, injured. And again, you know, these people were quite a vision to him, quite a shock, quite a waking up. And thirdly, it gets worse. He actually saw a corpse being carried to the charnel grounds, the burning grounds. And again, this caused him deep reflection and questioning that people do actually die. And this is how it is, you know, this is it. We get older, we get sick, and we die. And it was quite a wake-up call for young Siddhartha seeing this. And he was quite tormented and sad, and obviously this had an effect. And the last sight, it gets a bit jollier now, is that he actually saw a mendicant or holy man who was walking along the road. And this was a sort of monk-like figure that had cut off all worldly ties and was a sort of truth seeker. There was quite a lot in those days around. There was a lot of people that went out wandering and trying to find the truth. And again, this was a sight that he saw that sort of made him wake up a bit. You know, there were people out there that was trying to see beyond what we were offered, beyond what we were given. And he was intrigued. And I often think sometimes when something intrigues us, we want to sort of find out more. But of course, he had to go back to his comfortable life. And again, it wasn't that comfortable for him. I think it was starting to feel a bit constraining. And I was wondering what your four sights were and, you know, what took you in the direction that you're in now. So that's something that we could think about in the second half when we're meditating in a way. I'll drop that in. But, you know, what things have we seen that have sort of really sort of made us sad and shook us up and have changed our path, or things that have really lifted us and inspired us and taken us into a different path. And I think for me, I remember in the 70s, I often talk about it, there was a couple of TV programs that I saw that had a massive impact on me. And I was only little, but they really did. And one was people starving in Africa, and another was these wildebeest cattle that were trying to sort of get from one place to the other. And they had a horrible time. And it still sticks with me. I'm 56 now and it still sticks with me. So I was 7 then. And those sites were really powerful. You know, I thought, oh my gosh, there's a bigger world out there than Slough, which was where I was living at the time. And also, what's going on? Why is no one helping these animals or these people? You know, and it was very, very upsetting for me. And you know, nothing's changed in some ways. You know, things have changed, and at the same time, we still are watching TV and these things are happening. But I have more of an understanding now, and you know, more of an understanding of it. So yeah, these sites, I'm sure we've all had something in our lives that has made us change course, you know, taken the ship a different way. So sometime much later, back to Siddhartha, on a full moon night, Siddhartha felt the need to say goodbye to his family. He really did feel at this point, after much thought, that he wanted to sort of move on and see what was out there. And I'm not sure if he thought about coming back afterwards. You know, sometimes you think, well, I'll go for a bit and then I'll come back. Or maybe he just felt, actually, I really, really want to go and see, you know, what's going on in the world. I want to see what's going on, and I want to see what the truth is, and yeah, see more. He snuck out and he travelled many miles to the river boundary away from where he lived. And he left his fine clothes, his horse, and he cut off his hair and his beard, and he became a homeless wanderer. So in a way, that's symbolic of him cutting off his ties with all his attachments, just totally liberated from anything that's going to hold him back. And just sort of really going for it. And I think there's something about feeling really liberated there, you know, when you just sort of move forward and without constraint, just go on your way. In India at the time, there were many truth seekers and wandering ascetics. And I think it was because, again, as I say, there were no online courses, there was no social media, there was no Buddhist books. So people did really want to see what was out there. There was the sun, the moon, the stars, you know, the myth of life. And people were searching to see what was going on. And there was many different practices, as there are now, and many mendicants who practiced not only sort of going forth, but also severe ascetics. So sort of great self-denial and austerities, which are usually linked to religion. So it was a bit trendy in those days to sort of, you know, practice these austerities. And Siddhartha gained a reputation as a great ascetic because he too decided that he would limit his food and his sleep severely. And he didn't wash. And it was said that this lasted several years and he gained many followers. So he sort of thought this might have been a way into insight, you know, to sort of just not take anything in, not need anything, and just practice like these other monks that he was witnessing. But at some point, realizing that this practice was not the way to truth, and to the dismay of some of his followers who were practicing the ascetic practices, Gotama took a little food, and when after some time he grew stronger, he decided to travel on foot from place to place. Eventually settling under a large tree and resolved not to move until enlightenment. So I've condensed this work into this sort of, you know, 20-minute story. It all sounds very, very sort of flipped. But yes, I mean, he'd had several teachers at that time that he had practiced with, but again, sort of didn't settle. He wasn't a settler. He was somebody that sort of thought, okay, yes, I've had that teaching, but it still doesn't feel like it's broken through to enlightenment, to truth of reality. So he carried on. So he reached this Bodhi tree or fig tree, and he resolved not to move until he gained enlightenment. So he was going to sit in deep meditation. And you might be familiar with the story of Mara. Some of you might be familiar with the story of Mara. And this happens while he sits under the tree. So in a sense, it was like a battle of the mind. And you know, sometimes when you put really good intentions in place, like I'm going to go to the Buddhist center, and I'm going to be early, and I'm going to do this. And then the phone rings or some old friend turns up and says, I brought a cake. And you kind of think, oh, okay, then I'll do that. well, this was like 1,000 times worse for the Buddha. In a way, you know, he was self-controlled and concentrated, but while he was working on the mental hindrances, defilements, this huge almighty battle of distraction took place. All sorts of temptations came into his mind. All sorts of things came along that sort of made him think, I'll just get up from the tree and go and have a good time. You know, go and have a good time. Why am I doing this? But he knew really what he wanted to do. He was fiercely sort of adamant that this was the way. But we know in our own minds, you know, we're pulled quite a lot, and that can be immensely draining. So yeah, on a smaller scale, I probably get this quite a lot. You know, I should be doing that, but I could be doing this. But I might do that. Oh, but then there's this. And that was probably, as I said, very, very strong for the Buddha. Eventually, after a long time, a full illumination arose and the Buddha himself was born. So the Buddha was, the meaning of the Buddha is the enlightened one. And sitting under the tree, he gained full and perfect enlightenment through meditation and through overcoming all his defilements and samskaras and the sort of war on Mara, this mythical figure that was sort of battering him here and there until his mind was clear and radiant. He stayed there for several weeks after his enlightenment. And again, I can't even imagine that. You know, I'm just talking away here, but I can't even imagine what it would be like to just sort of feel that you had fully awoke, that you'd let everything go, your attachments, your conditioning, everything had just gone asunder, you know, it had just broken away. And again, you know, sometimes it's good to just sit and reflect on that a little bit. Otherwise, it just becomes words. The Buddha gained enlightenment. Woo, great. But actually, it's a fast thing that I don't even understand. So you know, really sort of take that in and just sit and think, what does that really mean? What would it have looked like? Even the Buddha sort of had doubts about how he was going to describe it. So for me, it's just a vast thing. So he was that sort of, you know, taken by it. That he sat for several weeks, and he actually bowed to the tree when he left for gratitude, for sort of giving him shelter whilst he gained enlightenment there. So the next section is his decision to teach. And again, this was a huge thing to do. Was he going to try to take his enlightenment process forward? Or was he just going to be enlightened and live you know, in seclusion, in happiness, in radiating his Dharma life for himself? And again, you know, it's a big thing, isn't it? Big thing. Were there people out there that were able to understand him? Were there people receptive enough? Or were people just going to sort of say, oh, you're weird, you know, go away, we don't understand you. You were that Shakyan man a few weeks ago, go back there, you know. So, yeah. So, in a sense, the Buddha's experience was difficult to put into words because it transcended language. And even he was thinking, well, how would I do that? How am I going to do that? Is it worth doing that? You know, that must have been a real dilemma. It was said that he had a connection during that time with a celestial being who said that his efforts would not be in vain. He said that there are many beings with little dust in their eyes who will be lost if they do not hear the truth from the Buddha. Beings with little dust in their eyes. People who were receptive, people who were looking, people who were searching for the truth. People who were struggling in the sea of samsara, in the miseries of life. And if the Buddha had decided not to teach, then we wouldn't be sitting here now. There wouldn't be Dharma centers all over the world. There wouldn't be people practicing. So I'm glad that he did. In a sense, this was the end of the quest, but also the beginning. So he'd become enlightened, but it was his decision whether he was going to carry on or just stop. And again, you know, I think, what would I do? And I don't know. We don't know, do we? But it's a sort of big, big decision, isn't it? After several weeks of quiet contemplation, the Buddha left Bodh Gaya, where he became enlightened, and wanted to make his awakening known. Previous teachers that he'd stayed with, Lama Kalama and Udaka Ramputra, had passed away, because they were the first people that he thought, I need to go and tell them what's happened, but they were no longer there. So he sought out some former disciples that he in the Deer Park. And when they first saw him, they were a bit disappointed because he'd given up his ascetic practices. So they were a little bit scornful of him and a little bit suspicious, because the Buddha looked a bit fatter and he wasn't starving himself anymore. And they were like, well, he's a bit fickle, because he gave up that practice of 6 years where he was sort of skin and bone and nearly dying. So we're not sure if we trust him. But the Buddha himself, he was like, well, just listen, just listen to this. And if it doesn't work, if you don't believe me, go. So they did. And the Buddha gave his first discourse, which was the sermon that set the wheel in motion. And that included the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path. So it's the first turning of the wheel of the Dharma through his 5 disciples. The Buddha then went on to walk northeast India, and he taught for approximately 45 years. And it was said that 9 months of each year he spent wandering on foot from town to town, village to village, wherever he felt he needed to be. And it would have been treacherous. Again, we take ourselves back to the beginning, jungles, bandits, disbelievers, skeptics, people of different faiths. It would have been quite a treacherous thing to do. And I can't imagine, once again, me going, barefooted around Shropshire, even trying to take the Dharma from place to place, let alone half of England. So, it was quite a thing to have done. And 3 months of the year he spent sheltering in a rainy season, which was sort of monsoon time in India. So there would have been monks and people, hearsayers, coming to the spot where he stayed. The Buddha had thousands of followers. These were villagers, people of much wealth, those with nought, travellers and other beings out of curiosity that decided to come along and have a look. He had many dedicated disciples and was known as the greatest spiritual teacher in India. But this reputation didn't sort of go to his head. He still used a begging bowl, he ate once a day, and he lived as a homeless mendicant. And that in itself is unique, because we know these days, particularly in the media, once people start to get a bit of fame or wealth or reputation, they sort of lose it, don't they? So the Buddha, he just carried on. He just carried on being himself and taking the Dharma out there. That was his priority. Everything else didn't really matter. He'd sort of broken away from all that sort of ego and arrogance and fame and collecting fans and that kind of thing. He wasn't a media star, which is very, very impressive. The Buddha Shakyamuni was free from all samskaras, free from all worldly attachments, liberated, and chose to share his experience for the benefit of all beings. So he decided not to keep it to himself and not just to think, oh, eureka, it's done. He then went on for 45 years of his life until he died, teaching to all sorts, all beings. And as we were not of that time, it's hard to imagine, but we can come to know the Buddha in the process of actualizing our own potential Buddhahood from knowledge and experience, and remembering that to know the Buddha goes beyond factual knowledge and study. So we can kind of talk about the Buddha and his going forth and his journeying, and we can sort of read about it, and that's really important because it keeps it alive. But something about our own experience, looking at the facts and seeing how they affect our lives and our going forth and how we feel. And this little poem that I read, really like, by Robert Bly. And it's something quite short about it. I really like haiku. I really don't like long poems. These ones that have sort of 6 pages, and I always think, you've lost me now. But I like haiku, and this is a little bit like haiku. It's by Robert Bly, and it's called Watering the Horse. How strange to think of giving up all ambition. Suddenly I see with such clear eyes the white flake of snow that has just fallen on the horse's mane. Imagine giving up all ambition. And the only thing that matters is that white flake of snow on the horse's mane. I really love that. And to most people, they probably won't understand it, because it's like, what's that about? A white snowflake on a horse's, which gradually dissolves as well, and then the horse will move on. There's nothing there. But just in that very moment, very moment, it's just very alive, it's very there, really seeing it. And there's no reason for it. No, there's nothing to do or say or tell, just that white snowflake dropping on a horse's mane. Lovely. Good. So the Buddha's going forth for his sort of journey. It's just sort of epic, isn't it, really? It's epic. And there's so much other stuff that I've left out. It's a big thing. And I think this is quite, there's many different books, but I think Gautama Buddha by Vishvapani Bloomfield is very good as an accessible read on the Buddha. If you want to sort of, just have a sort of a novel of the Buddha to read. But there's so many deep books that you can read, and so many versions. So, well, we've got 20 minutes, so I think we will break for questions. And one of them will be, what sites brought you into connection with the spiritual path? So those can be sites that sort of brought joy or sadness to you, whatever they were. Something brought you to the spiritual path, and only you know what that is. You might not want to share it, but it's okay if you don't, or if you do. So what sites brought you into connection with the spiritual path? And have there been any aspects of your life that you have had to walk away from? And again, you might not want to share that in a major way, but is there something in your life at some point, whether it be a substance or a person or a lifestyle, or just something even in yourself that you had to just say, actually, I'm moving away from that, and I'm going for this because this is better. This is what I want. And it takes a lot of courage and bravery, and sometimes a lot of struggle to do that. And people, a lot of people put up and shut up. They say this sort of term, put up and shut up. And some people do, they go through their whole life and they say, oh, I wish if I'd had my life again, I would have done it better, or I would have left him. So something like that. And you kind of think, oh, it's a bit sad in a way, but we do put up with things. And I think sometimes that's good. That's, consistency and just staying put and being loyal. But sometimes there's a point where we just think, no, I have to shift. I have to move. I don't want these conditions to be part of me anymore. I don't want to bolster up these conditions. And I just need to break through and get out of them. It's a very courageous thing to do. Although for some people, it can be very easy. Like giving up smoking. Some people say, oh, I packed up in a week. And other people, kept going back to smoking, then gave it up, then went back again. So the Buddha, in a way, he exemplifies going forth. And we all in ourselves, to have brought our way onto the spiritual path, have in some way gone forth. Yeah. So, yeah, what sites brought you into connection with the spiritual path? And have there been any aspects of your life that you have had to walk away from or break away from?